Hey guys, my name is Emma, and we are going to start a shooting in manual series. So we did the exposure triangle, but now we're going to move into demystifying shutter speed, ISO, and aperture in further detail. So today is all about shutter speed. Let's dive in. So to start off, let's go over just a little bit of camera anatomy so that you can understand what a shutter is. So there's this kind of like folding mechanism inside of your camera that lets in light or doesn't let in light. And it'll open for however long you want it to or close for however long you want it to. Most of the time with your shutter speed, you're going to be dealing in fractions of a second. So it closes and opens very fast. But 1/8,000th of a second is very different from 1/6 of a second or 5 seconds. And so it lets in more or less light depending on how long it's open, and that can be for a minuscule amount of time or a slightly longer amount of time. So iPhones and cell phones, they do not have a physical shutter in them. It's more digital and I don't completely understand it, but DSLRs, our bigger professional cameras, they do have a physical mechanism, a shutter, that is opening and closing. That's what makes that iconic camera photo taking sound, the click click. That's your shutter. So you might remember from my exposure triangle video, I talked about how there are pros and cons to the shutter. When it is slow, you're going to let in more light, but you have the potential for more motion blur. When it is fast, you're going to let in less light, but you are going to freeze your image. You're going to have a crisper, sharper photo, especially when it comes to movement. So let's go into the case for a slow shutter. The first one I mentioned already is you intentionally want motion blur. So you've probably seen it around by now. You might even do it yourself. You want a blurry, artistic looking portrait of someone. So in this case, your aperture is probably lower and you know where your ISO is, but you want to show that movement when they're moving. You want to show the hair moving. You want to show them walking, but you want it to be blurry. It's artistry and it's fun. It's not great for showing the details of a photo, but it's great for having a good time with your photos. So I'm not going to fault you for that. So you might want to slow shutter speed for that. You might find yourself shooting at 1/30 or 1/10 to get the effect that you want. It just depends on how much other light is coming in, where your aperture is set out, where your ISO is. So the second case for a slow shutter would be if you are photographing the night sky or doing astrophotography. So when it comes to photographing a meteor shower, for example, you're going to want to show the trail of that light. You're going to want to show the meteor moving through the sky. But you want everything else to be still. You want the stars that aren't moving to remain where they are. If you're showing any of the ground, you want that to stay put as well. And so you're going to need a tripod so that everything else visually remains still, but that meteor is moving across the sky. You got to have that slow shutter though, because if you have it too fast of a shutter speed, it's just going to look like a star like anything else, and that's not as fun. The third case for a slow shutter that I use the most myself is for realty or interior design photography. I shoot all of that photography on a tripod because I want a very high aperture so that I can get all the detail in the room, but I need a slow shutter so I can let in as much light as possible. If I were to boost the ISO, then the room is gonna look grainy and we don't want that. So I shoot at a very low shutter speed so that I can preserve the amount of grain that's in the photo, well, minimize the amount of grain that's in the photo, but also let in as much light as possible. Because with shutter speed, the only issue is that you're going to have like blur, and it's not going to increase your grain or anything if you have a slow shutter and you're letting in a lot of light. Like there's nothing wrong with that. And so if possible, you have your tripod so that you can lower your shutter speed as much as possible, make it nice and slow, raise that aperture for realty so you can see all the details, and then have your ISO low as well so that you don't have much grain. Now let's talk about the case for a fast shutter speed. One of the main reasons you're going to want a fast shutter speed is if you just have to have it. So you are doing portraits, your aperture is at 2.8, and it is a bright sunny day, you're gonna need to boost that shutter speed to 1/8000 or something, I don't know, that's the max on my camera, because there's just too much light happening around you. And that's totally fine. There's nothing wrong with that. That is probably the most common need for a fast shutter speed. The second reason you might find yourself wanting a faster shutter speed is if you are photographing sports or fast movement. So a lot of times when I do portraits, I might be at 1/200, which is super fine if people are moving at a slow pace. They're gonna be completely crispy, completely frozen. There's not gonna be any motion blur happening. But perhaps if someone does start running, like sprinting, you're gonna have some motion blur, and you might not want that depending on the photo that you're aiming for. Or if it's sports, someone's playing basketball and they're running super fast, they're bouncing a ball, you wanna freeze every single detail in that photo because it's important to telling the story, right? To capturing what's happening. So you're gonna want a higher shutter speed for that. A third scenario where you might want a fast shutter speed is if you are photographing wildlife or even something else where you just wanna freeze the motion. An example that I had this summer was when I was at the Grand Canyon and an elk was drinking from a water fountain, which was probably really bad and not advised for the park, but it's what happened and I took pictures. And it was drinking from this water fountain and it had all these water droplets going everywhere. And I got my settings dialed in so the exposure looked good. It wasn't too bright, it wasn't too dark, but these water droplets looked incredible. And I wanted to make sure that I froze all of those little water drops in the air and they weren't just blurry. So I adjusted my settings accordingly so that I could raise my shutter speed and freeze those droplets in midair. You might find yourself doing that if it starts to rain at a session, or it's snowing, or there's something else happening. Maybe you're doing a wedding exit and there's confetti falling, and you want to make sure that the confetti is frozen. That's when you want to raise your shutter speed. So you're going to raise your shutter speed. It's going to get darker, so you'll either need to lower your aperture or raise your ISO, but you're going to adjust that exposure accordingly, and you're going to know I can control my shutter so that I can control how this photo looks and make myself and my clients happier. That wraps it up. That is shutter speed in a nutshell, and it is the first video in our Shooting in Manual series. So stay tuned for ISO and aperture. They are on the horizon, and hopefully it will give you a better idea of these various components of shooting in manual so that you are in more control of what you are doing. And in the moment, you can get the photo that you want and need for whatever it is that you're looking for. That's my hope for you, because the more you can control those settings, the more you can wrap your mind around it and understand it, the better photographer you'll be. So thanks so much for tuning in, guys. I hope you have an awesome day. Oh, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe with any questions you have. Bye.